Down here we have this.
Live. Good evening and welcome. Okay, maybe be less muffled. Good to see you all. Welcome. This is the third installment of our program called Taking Questions on Our Front Porch. So welcome back. Welcome back, Larry.
Hi.
And welcome, Keith, tonight.
How are you?
This was Larry's great idea, and we are so happy to have your help. He's put together a roster of some of the local experts in partnership with the WIU History Department and Political Science Departments. So there's more to come after tonight as well. I also, in addition to thanking Larry, would like to thank the Illinois Humanities for their COVID relief grant. That's allowing us to sort of recraft our programs and try to figure out how to continue to bring the humanities to our community. So it's good to be in on this partnership with these people to help. So our front porch, it's a great place to sit and have a good conversation with people. It's a good place to learn how to ask questions. Asking questions is really at the heart of lifelong learning, I think. So I'm glad you're here to participate with us. This program, again, is more about questions than lecturing. So please feel free to jump in the comment section below the video. Say hello, introduce yourself. There's no strangers on the front porch. And put some questions in and we'll see if we can get the conversation started. But before we do, I wanted to share a little local history related to election time or election history. Recently, we got a recollection from Tweet Mummert, who was reminiscing about when he was 12 or 13 years old, about 7th grade, he says. He was working for the Macomb Daily Journal, which was located where Magnolia's is now. That would be the corner of Carroll and North Lafayette. And his job, he said, was to take a piece of glass that they had written the results on, as they had tabulated so far, across the street and up the stairs to the second floor, where they had put a projector that they could project through the glass and the numbers onto the building across the street. So people would gather in the street. He said they were all kind of well behaved and they would get the results. So a little far cry from Twitter and social media these days, but I guess it worked in 1936. So thanks, Tweet, for sharing that. And I pulled out an artifact from our collection. There you go. This was a torchlight parade donated by another lifelong resident, Pat Rourke, and it belonged to her grandfather, Frank Harris. And he was worked for the Macomb Daily Journal, but also was known as an ardent Republican. But Pat went to him saying that she was charged with putting together a parade or an event at the Lemoyne Hotel. It would have been 1954-56 for Adlai Stevenson. So these are bipartisan torches because that was our Democratic event. So her grandfather allowed her to use the Republican torches and also found her donkey. So she paraded into Lemoyne with the torches ablaze and her donkey, and I guess it was quite a statement for Adlai Stevenson's event. So a little local history for you before we get started. Okay, how about a couple ground rules for our front porch? Again, there's no strangers, and everybody's welcome on the front porch, and we do so with a lot of respect, right? And if we want to choose to engage, we do so constructively with a spirit of learning from each other. Questions will be taken from the feed online. I'll feed them to our guests up on the porch, and then we'll alternate with a handful of people here with us at the museum. Other than that, Larry's in charge, as usual. You're doing a great job, so we're gonna let you keep doing that. And they'll be here asking questions or answering questions until around 8:30. So let's get at it. You guys ready?
Yep.
All right, have at it. It's awful quiet.
Now? Okay. Hi, I'm Larry Balsamo. I'm a professor of history emeritus at Western. And it's my pleasure to introduce my partner tonight. Keith Boeckleman is the chair of political science, my good friend, native of Quincy, I believe.
That is correct.
Been here years, and not as long as I have. Nobody has, but Keith has consented to come in tonight to join us and talk about and answer questions about the recently completed election. Now, when I saw you 2 weeks ago, I told you about this topic, and I said then pray for us, because at that particular time, we really didn't know what was happening or how things have happened or what the results were. Well, we still don't know some things, but we do know some things. And so, Keith, welcome. You want to say anything first?
Well, thank you for having me. I guess, I had this feeling on election night that it was kind of deja vu or Groundhog Day or whatever you want to call it. So it seemed like that we were looking very much like 2016. Now that's changed a little bit in the last 2 weeks as the votes have come in. And as we know, Biden and the Democrats look to flip a couple of states that were traditionally Republican, as well as bringing the so-called blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan back into the Democratic column, although very narrowly. And so I think there's still a lot of division in the country. One good thing I think from the election you see is that there's very high levels of turnout, and I think that's something that's welcome compared to other advanced democracies. The U.S. has historically had fairly low levels of turnout. In fact, we're near the bottom. But this election was the best turnout since 1900, so I think that's a good thing.
Keith, what in the world happened with polling? What caused the apparent, again, from 4 years ago, you think the polls would be closer, but again, it seems there's a gap between polling and reality. What is going on?
Yeah, I think the polling industry is somewhat in crisis. As you suggested, the polls really failed in 2016 and seem to have failed even worse in 2020. There were some polls suggesting, for example, that Biden would win Wisconsin by 11 points, and the win ended up being very narrow, more like a percentage. Overall, the polls showed Biden winning about 8%. And, that's not too far off. And some of the defenders of the polls are saying, well, it's within the margin of error. And to some degree, that's true. I think the problem is it systemically seems to be undercounting Republican votes, both in the 2016 election, the 2020 election, and also in many cases in the 2018 midterm elections. The Florida governor's race is one that comes to mind that was off. So there seems to be a big problem with the polls. Now, my understanding is the reasons are somewhat different between 2016 and 2018. In 2016, the basic problem was the polls underestimated the number of working class whites who were going to be in the electorate. So they picked up that they were voting for Trump, but where they went wrong is in the composition of the electorate, and they underestimated the amount of those Trump supporters who would come out. This time, it's a little bit different and more troubling, I think, in many ways, because what happened with the polls this time is that they were accurate in terms of the composition of the electorate, but they were wrong in terms of how people were voting. And so the basic demographic characteristics of the electorate, the polls predicted those correctly. But what they didn't do is predict how those people were going to vote. And so that in some ways is a more serious problem. So, for example, more minority voters than the polls indicated voted for Trump, and across other demographic characteristics as well, more well-educated voters than the polls predicted voted for Trump. And so that's a more serious matter, I think harder to fix. It's not just a matter of making some statistical adjustments. It's really a matter of how well you're sampling. And again, that's really hard to get at. I think that this has serious implications also because we have to wonder if other polls are accurate. I mean, we've seen election polls not being accurate, but do we wonder now if other polls won't be accurate as well? So, for example, President Trump, through most of his term, has never had above a 50% approval rating. But what if that's not true? You can sort of go down the line. Polls show that the Affordable Care Act is supported by a majority of Americans. But what if that's not true? And so I think it's not just a matter of calling elections wrong. And frankly, I could do without election polls. I like the suspense of elections. But I think it's a more serious matter in the sense that if polls are not predicting public opinion accurately, public officials and so forth don't have any gauge between elections to know what the public thinks. And I think that's a serious matter.
Still, the polls were better than they were originally. In 1936, the only poll I've ever heard about was something from an outfit called Literary Digest, a magazine. And they predicted that Alf Landon, the Republican nominee for president in 1936, was going to win. Franklin Roosevelt carried every state but Maine and Vermont in 1936. And what had happened apparently with the Literary Digest, they did phone polls. And the number of people who owned phones during the Great Depression tended to be wealthier Republican types who, of course, came across with what they said. So, you know, I'm no pollster. I personally get addicted to something called 538, and you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's an outfit run by Nate Silver, and it's on Google. You can Google it up. And what he does apparently is take a compendium of polls, a whole group of polls, and average them out. Well, he gave Trump a 10% chance of winning the presidency this time. He said the Democrats were a 3 out of 4 chance to win control of the Senate. He predicted a 10 or 12 seat gain for the Democrats in the House. And all of these just didn't work out very well. Trump did not win the presidency, but 10% chance, that's not a very high percentage chance of winning.
And Silver is kind of defending the poll, saying, well, you know, they're only 3 or 4% off, which is nationally within the margin of error. But again, I don't find that defense particularly convincing if the error is always in the same way. Yeah. You know, if Biden would have won by 12% or something like that, then I would have found that argument more convincing. But there seems to be a systematic error in the polls that's undercounting Republicans. And so, you know, the pollsters have a difficult task now in the cell phone era and so forth. It used to be in the old days, you could go through the phone book and call every 20th person or every 50th person or whatever. Now, you know, they will do things like random dialing of cell phone numbers. But the problem is nobody's going to pick up if they don't know who is calling. I mean, I don't. If I don't know who's calling me, if they're not in my contacts, I'm not going to pick up. Mm-hmm. And most people don't. So it's very difficult to get a good sample. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to the pollsters. But I do think there's a serious problem. And I think this was harder to fix than the 2016 problems.
One solution or one suggestion I've heard, and maybe the pollsters already do this, is to construct a model of a group of citizens in a certain area. If you carefully pick balance to match the demographics and you follow them during the whole election, instead of calling random people or calling a spectrum of people, you simply follow that group of 30 or 40 from, say, April through November. But then you got to be careful about whom you pick to get some kind of breakdown that's reliable. Should we open it up for a question?
Yeah, we've got a couple questions coming in.
Go ahead, Sue.
The first is there a recount rule in the state of Illinois? How close the results should be before automatic recount?
Is there a recount rule in the state of Illinois?
Well, the basic rule, and I don't know the details of how close it has to be, but the person asking for the recount has to pay for it. So the campaign that's asking for the recount has to pay for the recount, which kind of discourages recounts unless you get really close. Now, I should know this, but I don't. If there's an automatic thing where it kicks in at a certain level, I'm honestly not sure about that. Sorry.
Does it cover just state elections or federal elections as well?
Well, this would be for either federal or state elections, yeah.
Another question, Sue, go ahead.
Anybody from in here? Yeah, go ahead.
We'll get them next. Go ahead and okay, go.
Keith, in looking at the poll results, you're talking about polls. It seems that many of the national polls, looking at the total popular vote, were a little closer to accurate, where some of the real inaccuracies cropped up were in some of these state polls, such as one which had in Wisconsin, which was just declared today a 12-point victory margin for Biden's ticket. So some of these state polls were really off.
Right. I mean, I think there was one New York Times poll that had Biden up 17% in Wisconsin. So, I mean, that's way, way, way out of the ballpark. And I think Michigan, similar. So some of these close states where there's more polling, sometimes the samples are smaller in the state polls, and so that you're going to have a bigger margin of error anyway. But yeah, the state polls, and that was true in 2016 also. The state polls were more off. I mean, they didn't, they had most of these states a flip from Democratic column to Trump, going for Democrats again, like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so, so the state polling is even more troubling, and you have even more difficult sampling issues sometimes at the state level, and I think that's partly why. But yeah, again, some of these were way off.
I wonder, and I have no basis for determining this, if some of the underrepresentation of Trump voters isn't based upon the fact that members of Trump voters don't like experts, don't believe much in science, and so they react to pollsters either by not responding or by responding in a way different than they end up voting. Now, I suggested this to a person I know involved in polling, my son-in-law who lives in Sweden, who does it for a living, and he suggested it had to do more with improper modeling than it had to do with people making deliberate decisions to be undercounted or to undermine pollsters. Don't know.
Well, I mean, some of the national pollsters, I would agree with you than your son-in-law. And for example, President Trump is often critical of the New York Times and saying, you can't trust the New York Times. And so then the New York Times calls up and says, will you participate in our poll? Well, if you're a Trump supporter, what are you going to do? I mean, are you going to do that? I think likely not. So I do think, and the New York Times themselves, their pollsters have essentially admitted that. So I think there is something to that.
So
Yeah, we've got another question coming up on the screen. Do we need to worry about the Electoral College? What did the July Supreme Court ruling really mean in terms of the way electors have to vote? We had some earlier questions about the Electoral College.
They're talking about the faithless elector, I think.
Well, yeah. So the Supreme Court ruled basically that states can prohibit faithless electors if they choose. So a faithless elector is basically someone who votes against their party. So the idea of the Electoral College is whoever wins the popular vote in that state, that party gets to cast the electoral votes. And so the assumption is that, take Illinois, for example. This is the Democrats won Illinois, that they will cast their votes for Biden. Or in Iowa, Trump won the popular vote. And so the Republican electors will get to cast their votes. The assumption is they will cast their votes for Trump. But constitutionally, that's not required. The electors can vote for whomever they want. Now, some state, and that's called the faithless elector problem. Some states have laws that require the electors to vote for the popular vote winner in that state. And so the question before the Supreme Court last year was, is it constitutional to restrict the electoral votes in that way? The Supreme Court said it was. So they allowed states to prohibit faithless electing if they choose. They don't have to, and some states do, some states don't. But if they choose to, they can do that. So I think from that perspective, it doesn't make too much difference in terms of the Electoral College. I mean, I think it would have made more of a difference if they would decide the other way, perhaps, if you had more faithless electors. The faithless elector has never been a huge problem. It's never switched an election. If you recall, in 2016, there was some pressure on the electors, some of the Republican electors, to switch their vote to Hillary Clinton, so they reflect the popular vote. That didn't happen. Often the faithless elector is more comedic. If you remember, the football coach Bear Bryant, one of the Alabama electors voted for him years ago. And so it's never really affected an election. I think a bigger concern that's probably also not going to come true is there were concerns that states might send alternate slates of electors that went against the popular vote in the state. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. Even if it did, I don't think we're in a, and I can go into the nuts and bolts of that if you want later, but I don't think it would be something that would affect the election, given the fact that both houses of Congress would have to agree on which slate of electors would be sent. And if they can't agree, then the governor of the state gets to decide. And so, for example, in Pennsylvania, which is one of the states where this scenario may have played out, if they sent alternate slate of electors, the governor's a Democrat, and it's doubtful that he would support the non-democratic electors. So I think that scenario is far-fetched, although some people were talking about before the election, and maybe if it had been closer in some of these states, that could have possibly happened.
You want to talk about the Electoral College? We had an earlier question sent in to us about how does the Electoral College determine it's the number of members of Congress and senators in each state? So let's say Wyoming has 2 senators and 1 congressman, they get 3 electoral votes. California has a much bigger population, they get dozens of electoral votes. So the number of electoral votes is what counts in presidential elections, not the popular vote. And there have been cases, as we are well aware, 7 of the last 8 elections, 2 of the last 8 elections, the popular votes and the electoral vote have not matched up.
Right.
2000 and 2016. It's happened in the 19th century as well. So it does happen. Why do we have an electoral college? You get to deal with that because you're in political science.
Well, so like a lot of things with a constitutional structure is kind of a compromise. I guess the best way to explain is the basic idea behind the Electoral College is sort of like the College of Cardinals in the Catholic Church. And so sort of the idea of bringing the wisest people together and having them select the leader. But there was a lot of debate about how this should work. James Madison, who's often considered the father of the Constitution, actually preferred a popular vote for president. But some of the southern states where voting rights were very limited and a very small population, a percentage of the population, I should say, was allowed to vote, really were opposed to that. So this Electoral College, like a lot of things, was kind of a compromise. And the idea, again, was that these would be the wisest people in the state, and they would be the ones who could inform the voters about, or would be most informed and make a wise decision. Now, some states immediately sort of turn it over to the popular vote. Other states turn it over to the state legislature. So states have done it in different ways over time. But now every state, of course, does it by the popular votes. The popular vote winner in that state is the one who gets the electoral votes. Now, there are a couple of states that have a district system, and this is actually something that many of the framers favored. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton seemed to have preferred this approach that Nebraska and Maine use, where they divide up their Electoral College votes. So in those states, the person who wins the state gets the 2 votes for the Senate, and in each congressional district, you look at who won that congressional district, and whoever won that gets that electoral vote. So, for example, in Nebraska, which has 5 electoral votes, Trump won the state, so he got the 2 for Senate. He also won 2 of the 3 congressional districts, so he got those 2 electoral votes, so he got 4. Joe Biden won the district that's around Omaha, the more urban district in Nebraska, and so he got 1 electoral vote from Nebraska. So it was a 4-to-1 breakdown. But that's an exception. Most states divide it up, or they don't divide it up. They have the winner-take-all system. So again, you have a very narrow win is what matters. Sue, I don't know if you have that hand or in your program. It shows a handout that says Democratic margin in blue wall states, and you can see very narrow wins for the Republicans in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, under 1% in 2016, and then they flipped to the other side. Michigan maybe somewhat substantially, but the others very narrowly. So you've really got about a 1.5% difference in the popular vote. So, the Electoral College gives sometimes this illusion of a big change, but in these states, really, there was a very small change in how people voted. But since it's a winner-take-all system, the electoral votes all go one way in the end. Let me make a comment. There was a question, I think, about what's the future of the Electoral College. And so the map that Sue just showed kind of relates to that. So there's a lot of interest, I think. Well, it's obviously become partisan now because the Electoral College in some ways not in some ways, it does favor the Republicans, so they don't want to get rid of it. The Democrats see it working against them, so they do want to get rid of it. Back before the 2000 election, I think there was more maybe openness to changing the Electoral College to going to a popular vote. But to just go to a straight popular vote of the people, you'd have to change the Constitution, which is very difficult. It takes a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, and then it takes 3/4 of states to ratify it. So that's hard to do. The map that Sue showed you, and if you go, those of you who are in person, if you go to kind of the end where you see the map with the green states in it. So this is an indication of the national popular vote compact. And what this is an agreement among various states, and the states that are indicated in green, that these states have agreed that if they get to 270 electoral votes, in other words, if states accounting for 270 electoral votes agree to this, then those states will cast their electoral votes for the popular vote winner, regardless of what happens in their state. So now you have the popular vote winner in a state, that party casts the electoral votes. Under this, and this will only happen if it gets to 270, whoever wins the popular vote nationwide, those states would cast their electoral votes for that person, regardless of what happens in their state. So we're at about 196 votes now, I think, and you can see a lot of these are the kind of blue states. Illinois is one example. And so I'm kind of looking at this map. I'm wondering where we get more states out of this, and I don't see any obvious next steps, really. So this is probably stuck at about 196 electoral votes right now. But this would be an easier way to get the popular vote winner to sync with the Electoral College and a constitutional amendment. I would say what would probably have to happen for a constitutional amendment to happen would if a Republican presidential candidate got a majority of the popular vote and then lost the Electoral College. Then it happened to both parties. I think then both parties can see, okay. But in the absence of that, I think that it's unlikely to change.
You notice what Keith said in there. The proposal he's talking about would require states to act. To me, the United States has the most decentralized election system of any democracy I've ever heard of. So you've got 50 states, you've got 50 different voting potential procedures for write-ins, mail-ins, absentee voting, postmarked, all kinds of stuff, which makes changing a system almost impossible because you can't mandate it from the top. It has to be done by individual states. When the founding fathers set this up, there were 13 different colonies with 13 different political cultures, which they were aware of. And in some states like South Carolina, there was a very strong property qualification for voting. And another state like Delaware, for example, there wasn't. And so they had that on top of everything else. I do not think the founding fathers intended for the electoral vote and the popular vote to not be in sync. I think they assumed that would probably be the case. And in most of our elections, it has been. It's just that it's happened 2 out of the last 3, 4, 5 elections, which is causes people to think about it. And it is really hard. If you want to look at the language in this Article 2, Section 1, which describes the Electoral College and voting procedures, I mean, it's murky and it's tough, and it'd be very difficult to change the Constitution. Virtually every small state would oppose it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's unlikely to happen. Just on your point about the election, I wanted to pick up on a couple of things on that. I was talking to a group of students from Norway on election day, and they were asking questions, and it blew their minds, the idea that states would be in charge of elections. I mean, they could not process that idea. But I think it's also when you hear things about Russian hacking or Chinese hacking or whatever, and sort of threats to the electoral system, I think that's much more. I mean, maybe the states dilute it a little bit, but I also think the states don't always have the expertise to fight back on that. And so from that perspective, I really think a national election system would be better.
Question, Sue?
Anybody in the room have a question?
There's a question. One of the things I noticed from the results that's quite striking is that Trump got quite a high share of minority votes, especially nearly a third of Hispanic, Latino, and nearly a third of Asian votes. Andrew Sullivan, who's a conservative columnist, has speculated that the Republicans could possibly put together a new majority coalition. And this coalition would consist of the working class people that Trump appeals to, especially the white working class, tend to be less educated. Along with the money class that the Republicans currently have captured, but couple that with a higher share of the minority vote, especially with the theme of economic independence and entrepreneurship and economic growth being kind of the policy side of that might appeal to the minority community. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, Keith,
Go
about
ahead, Keith.
that possibility and your reaction to the fact that Trump has somehow, in spite of his racist tone and insulting behavior, captured such a large share of the minority vote.
Yeah, I think, and I have a lot of thoughts on that, obviously, and I'll try to express them in a coherent way. I think the first thing I would say is that if it does come, so I mean, I think what Andrew Sullivan is predicting, and I read a column he did that may be the same one you're referring to that kind of talked about some of these things. And so possibility of kind of a class-based coalition where you have kind of a working class party or a group that would appeal across racial lines, that would be kind of along the lines of Trumpism, versus a more college educated, I guess, for lack of a better word, suburban, however you want to call it, coalition. So I do think that's possible. I think one thing is, I mean, I think there's several things that complicate it. One is Trump himself. And so I think Trump both appeals to people and turns off people in ways that normal candidates don't. And so I think one big question we have, does Trumpism continue after Trump, or do we still, have some kind of remnants of that? And why I think that's important is, some of the policy positions that Trump took in 2016 didn't necessarily govern on, I think, were appealing to maybe lower income people in the sense of trying to protect some aspects of the welfare state. So saying, I'm not going to cut Social Security. I'm not going to have these endless wars where, working class people maybe are bearing the brunt of that. I'm going to stop shipping your jobs overseas. And so I think those kinds of things can appeal to working class people and can do so across racial lines. My question would be, will other Republicans take those same policy positions? And if they don't, will they be able to recreate Trump's sort of coalition? Because you mentioned the idea of sort of part of this coalition is kind of the upper class or the money people. And I think that is kind of an element of the Republican coalition. But it's unstable in some way. Now, by the same token, I think the Democratic coalition, if the emerging Democratic coalition is sort of well-educated suburbanites, I think that's a little bit unstable too, from the perspective of, I think maybe the stereotypical suburban Trump voter or anti-Trump voter probably is really turned off by Trump's behavior, but they're not necessarily opposed to tax cuts and stuff like that. So some of the Republican ideology they may find more appealing. So if there's no Trump on the ballot, do they go back to their more traditional home? So I think there's a lot of complicated both policy and personality things that are going on here. And I don't know how they're all going to play out. But I do think you've got the possibility for more class-based politics than we've seen in the past. And I think that's something Trump ushered in a way. One other thing I would say just about the racial makeup, one thing that has kind of scared me and that seemed to be happening maybe before this election is the party become completely racialized. In other words, the Democrats are the part that all, I don't want to say all, but the Democrats are the minority party, if you want to put it that way, and the Republicans are the white party. And so to me, the fact that more minorities are voting for Trump is a positive sign in the sense that I think a completely racialized party system is probably not good and probably not stable. So I find that a positive sign in some ways.
Let me add a couple of things. I think part of the problems the Democrats have had is a kind of careless lumping together of all Latino voters. And we now know there are significant differences among them based upon nationality. Cuban American voters in Florida are conservative. They fled Cuba, or their ancestors did, to get away from what they call socialism. They're different than, say, Mexican American voters in Texas or Puerto Ricans or individuals like that. The second thing is, and by the way, and I'm not surprised the Republicans did well among the Cuban voters in Florida. They probably carried Florida for Trump. The second thing is, I think the really hard one to get your hand around is religion. And it's not Protestant versus Catholic versus Jew. It's evangelical fundamentalists in one direction and others another direction. And so there are certainly fundamentalist Catholic voters who are Latino. And so there's going to be a kind of touch there. And one of the touchy issues is abortion. Another one has to do with the prayer in school, all these kinds of issues that pollsters have a really hard time getting their hands around. And it's very hard for people who judge elections to get their arms around that one too. It's a lot more complicated.
And let me add one more thing that's a variable that I'm not sure how this plays out with sort of the Latino vote. The Democrats, because of COVID, were much less likely to engage in kind of on the ground activities, personal contact, voter to voter. I mean, President Trump was still having rallies. The Republicans are going door to door more. And there's some evidence that, that for Latino voters and others too, I'm not, but it's like South Texas, they talked about that outreach is very important. And so Trump was able to do that. The Republicans were able to do that in the way that the Democrats maybe were able to, but did in this election. So I don't know if that's a variable. I think it's possibly a variable too that may have contributed to the minority.
You're right about it being a variable. I think it may have had an even bigger impact on Senate races and House races. I'm kind of heartened by this in a sense. I understand the Democrats played it carefully and did not go out to spread diseases and so forth. And Joe Biden stayed away and did everything electronically. And Trump, I thought, recklessly went out and had public rallies and so forth. If you look at the amount of money that each party had, apparently the Democrats had a virtually 2-to-1 advantage in money they spent. But maybe they just spent it on television ads. And after you've seen the first round of television ads, I wonder if those things change many voters' minds. Whereas somebody knocks on your door or leaflets your neighborhood, there's a kind of human contact, which I'm really kind of glad the big money doesn't always win. And in this case, it didn't. Or it didn't have the effect the pollsters thought it was going to have.
And the political science evidence does show that person-to-person contact is very important. Someone tells you to go out to vote. That's much more important than a TV commercial. And so, and somebody's knocking on your door, particularly somebody from your neighborhood, that has a big impact. So I think that could be another thing that was going on in this election. We'll see, how that plays out.
Sue?
Yep, we got another question. We put on the screen for you. The margin of popular vote difference is getting larger for Democrats. What would be or could be implications of this on the future elections? Is demographics changing in favor of the Democrats?
That's yours.
I yes and no. I hate to answer it that way. I think it's a little bit, again, Donald Trump is such a wild card that's a little bit hard to judge what's going on. But I think one thing that's clearly going on is that Donald Trump is not doing as well as Republicans in general. And so Joe Biden's popular vote leads now about 6 million. Republicans have some inherent advantages in the Senate, clearly, but also in the House. So Democrats have to win a lot more votes to get a majority in the House than Republicans do, and same in the Senate. But that said, Trump is running behind, at least in some places, not always, but at least in some places, the congressional candidates. So getting back to the question, I think one thing that's kind of interesting that's going on is you've got a kind of electoral college transition. So people talk about the blue wall, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And that's what, saved the Democrats this time, not alone. But they're going to be losing electoral votes because this part of the country is losing population. Meanwhile, so you've got states like Arizona and Georgia that are gaining electoral votes, but for the Democrats to be able to capitalize on it, that process needs to be solidified, needs to keep trending that way, or else the Democrats get kind of caught in this no man's land between the old blue wall, which is now losing force because they're losing electoral votes, and these sort of Sunbelt states that are becoming more Democratic but haven't quite gotten there yet. So I think, that's something to watch. But it's, be states like North Carolina, which still Republican in this election, both at the Senate level and at the presidential level. Georgia, which, narrowly went for Biden. Florida, that's the Democrats' Moby Dick or whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't seem to be, they can't seem to reel it in. So, I think in popular vote terms, the Democrats do have some advantages. I'm not sure they're growing, but I think they do have some advantage. But in electoral vote terms, I'm not so sure. I don't know if that answers the question. But
again, some of this widening, the margin may simply be the way the states count votes. I mean, if these are absentee votes or if they're mail-in votes, they may have been by mandate or by custom counted last. And it looks to me like Democrats took advantage of mail-in votes, early voting, better than the Republicans did. And that partly Trump caused that. He cast doubts upon the legality and the safety of votes other than going and putting your ballot box in a polling place. So there's all kinds of things going on. Now, is this the wave of the future? This kind of voting in the wave of the future? Well, it's convenient. So I don't know.
Sue, on this little monitor here, it says low battery. I don't know if you wanted to know that, but okay. So I just thought I'd share that with you.
Technology will kill you or keep you
We'll
alive.
get that close-up shot of you.
Okay.
Live by technology, die by technology.
Thank you.
But one other thing, again, with the sort of Democrats, for example, have a huge advantage in California. They pile up the votes in California, which is a big state, but it doesn't really do them that much good at the presidential level because, they could win it by millions fewer votes and still win it. So, again, it's kind of one of the things of the ins and outs of the Electoral College that.
Next, Sue.
This might not be an election question, but can Trump run in 2024 if
Yes.
he's convicted of a crime?
Oh, no, that's a good question.
Assuming he's not in jail.
He's legally can do it if he's not convicted of a crime, but
Well, if he's in jail, I don't think he could run, but I don't think there are any limits other than
it's
that.
going to be hard to have rallies.
Yeah, right. But I think even if he was a felon, I don't think that would preclude him from running for president.
The other thing is, what if he's convicted of a misdemeanor, like, violating something or falsifying something on a tax document? That keep you from running. I don't think anything keeps you from running except the good sense of the voters. And looking around me, I'd say he's going to be running. It's really hard to tell. There are 9 different times when a president in office serving one full term ran for re-election and didn't win. And this is the 9th time. And several of those guys before, like Martin Van Buren, ran for president on a different party and 8 years after he got defeated. And so it can happen. I mean, Trump could run again if he chooses to. My guess is that I think he may have had enough of the presidency. He likes the notoriety. So maybe another television program or some kind.
Yeah, although I think he will dangle it out there. I mean, he loves the rallies and that kind of thing. I don't think he liked being president all that much, but he loved campaigning for president. And so I think he may keep doing that, whether he ends up running or not. I think one interesting thing to watch, I mean, there's this famous book in political science called The Party Decides, which basically says the party elites control who the presidential nominee is. And about the time this book got published and Trump came along and that kind of shot that out of the water, I think it was more applicable probably to the Democratic process this time. But I think it'd be interesting to see how the Republican Party and the Republican Party elites process the Donald Trump experience. Do they say, all right, this is something we want more of? Or do they alter their rules in ways that might make it harder for him to win the nomination? I mean, I assume if he wants it, the nomination is his, but 4 years is a long time in politics too. And there's a lot of things that can happen. So I'm not sure how that will all play out.
Could he start his own party?
He could. Yeah, I mean, that's another possibility. I think that he might start his own, like some kind of third party run. My thought is the Democrats would be licking their chops on that if that were to happen, because that really splits the Republican Party then, and maybe the Republican Party ends up finishing third place even in the in the presidential race. And I think that it would be harder, not impossible. I certainly don't want to suggest. I think it would be harder for Donald Trump to win as a third party candidate than as a Republican, but it's possible. And I do think that that's something he could do, and he might want to do. There's also been speculation, for example, sort of the other side of what I was suggesting earlier, that Donald Trump Jr. is sort of making moves to take over the Republican Party apparatus. And so, if that were to happen, then I think that that's obviously sort of greasing the wheels for his dad to take another spin at it. Or even possibly another member of the family like him at some point. I don't know if that would be in 2024.
Well, Van Buren started a different party, and 8 years later they called the Free Soil Party, and he got 10% of the popular vote, no votes in the Electoral College, and he helped Zachary Taylor win the presidency. In 2012, Theodore Roosevelt had served McKinley's term, a term in his own right, laid out for 4 years. In 2012, he ran. 1912, yeah. Trump. Theodore Roosevelt's party was called the Bull Moose Progressive Party, and what he did was help make Woodrow Wilson president. So it was frustrating for him. So the precedents don't there, but then Donald Trump's unprecedented.
Right. And I don't think he has any particular loyalty to the Republican Party. So, I mean, I think if he saw it as advantageous to him, he would do it. So I don't know. I guess another way to look at it, I think Larry's right that, these third party candidacies are really unlikely. But if you want to look at like the Republicans during Lincoln's time as a third party, then that's another perspective on it. And, that it can happen, but I think where Larry's right is doubtful.
I have another question from online. What could the reasons behind Arizona turning blue? Some suggest that late Senator Mr. McCain's effect, since Senator McCain and Trump did not get along well.
Yeah, I think I think there's a number of things going on. I think one, like many Sunbelt states, you have a lot of migrants from maybe bluer states who may bring some of their political views with them. And that I think that's a movement. I think, Cindy McCain, again, as you mentioned, as the questioner mentioned, I think that gives some maybe traditional Republicans permission to vote. One other thing that I saw that was kind of interesting is that the Navajo population in Arizona, which is substantial, had a very high turnout and also voted overwhelmingly for Biden. Was very hard hit by COVID, and because of that, seemed to be inclined to make a change. And so again, that is another factor, I think, in the Arizona situation.
Incidentally, keep your eye on the newly elected Democratic senator from Arizona, Kelly, who's had not been an astronaut, and his wife was
Gabby Giffords, yeah.
Who was a congressman, been shot, suffered severely damaged head injuries. He, to me, seems to be a comer. And if Arizona is a coming state, if it's growing rapidly, they've got 11 electoral votes.
But sure, almost certainly more in 2024.
Oh yeah, easily, maybe 2 more. So, I mean, that's a possibility of, if we look ahead at 2024, 2028, depending on what happens to Biden and Kamala Harris.
Anybody in the room have a question? Nick's got one back there for you.
Keith, you focused on the national election, but there was some very important elections on the state level. And one of the features that was closely watched was what happened in gubernatorial and legislative races. These were areas where the Democrats hope to make some real gains. Now, these have largely remained in Republican hands, and of course, we have redistricting coming up again following the current census. And how do you see the impact of that?
Well, I think that this is a big disappointment for the Democrats. And let me say a couple of things about that. I mean, I think one, Republicans over the last 20, 30 years, however long period, have been more cognizant of the importance of state politics. And so they've understood the importance of state legislatures, not only from policy, how the important policy decisions they're making, but also from a redistricting standpoint. So, the Republicans made a concerted effort in the 2010 election to win over state legislatures, and they were successful in that. The Democrats have kind of gotten in the game a little bit. Eric Holder, President Obama's former attorney general, has this organization that's trying to focus on the states and also on redistricting. And so they, I think, had more efforts in that area this time. But I think it has to be seen from the Democrats' perspective as a disappointment, from the Republicans' perspective as a sigh of relief or maybe jubilation, however you want to look at it, what's happened at the state legislative level. The last I checked, I need to go back and double check on Arizona because I think one of the houses may have flipped, but the last I checked, no state legislative house had flipped to the Democrats. And there were hopes, like one of the Minnesota, I think maybe the Minnesota Senate, I forget which one of the Minnesota houses they were hoping to flip, and some other, I think, in Iowa and various states. And the Democrats were almost completely shut out in that and had very little gain, if any, at the state legislative level. So the implication for redistricting is in most states, I mean, Illinois, of course, is an exception, but in most states, the Republicans are going to stay in control of redistricting. And so that helps them control state legislatures. It helps them in Congress if they can, Wisconsin is a good example of where they've drawn districts in such a way that advantages them. And so I think that, one thing I sort of hate to talk about the next election, but I guess I'm going to. In 2022, I think the Democrats are in a really difficult situation sort of defending the U.S. House of Representatives. They lost some seats in the House, in the House of Representatives, somewhat unexpectedly, according to the polls. Not being in control of redistricting puts them at the mercy of Republican districts in many of these states. And so I think the Democrats are probably in a position where they're facing perhaps losing the federal House of Representatives as well in 2022 due to not having much power over redistricting.
Okay, a couple more questions. It says, a lot of discussion in the media about us being a republic or a democracy.
Political science question.
Well, so what is the question then?
What are we, a democracy or a republic?
Well, I guess what I would say is we're a republic that historically has moved in a more democratic direction. So, again, going back to the earlier question about the Electoral College, that's more of a Republican idea, the idea that people should be represented by other people who are wiser and are more plugged into the issues and so forth. Certainly the structure of Congress is the same thing. I think that we have moved in a more direction toward democracy in the sense that, originally U.S. senators were chosen by state legislatures, which is more consistent with the idea of a republic. Now they're chosen by the people, so that's more democratic. Initially, who got the vote was very limited. Now, of course, and I think rightfully, we have a much broader franchise, so women, African Americans, people who could not originally vote are allowed to vote. So we are a republic. Again, we don't vote on things directly. Members of Congress, state legislatures, and so forth, they make those decisions for us. And I frankly think rightfully so. I don't think that we should go to a position where voters are making decisions on complex issues by referendum or something like that. I do think the idea of having specialization. On the other hand, I think some aspects of the original Republican form of government, like the Electoral College, really don't work, as Larry suggested earlier, the way the founders intended. And so from that perspective, I think there's an argument for making them more democratic and allowing the people to have more direct say. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I was just thinking that it's difficult to amend the Constitution, but 3 of the 17 amendments, 4 actually, if you think about the 18-year-old vote.
Yeah, 18-year-old vote.
4 of the 17 have been really a factor of expanding the vote. 15th, 17th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, whatever that is, 18-year-old voting have expanded the suffrage, which it's an immense accomplishment. It changed the political landscape a lot. Keith, do you want to switch maybe to what we think is going to happen with the new president and the old president?
Well, let me take we can just take these questions
Okay.
first. If you have
You got some? Okay.
Well, he had one. Yeah.
Go ahead.
What are your observations on the loss of the fair tax amendment to the Constitution?
We're in for some hard times from the standpoint of money. That is clear.
Think you guys do it,
Yeah, I'm not completely surprised that it failed. I am a little surprised it didn't get above 50%. I anticipated it get between 50 and 60 and it needed 60 basically, although there's a little bit more complicated than that. But in general, it needs a 3/5 vote to pass. There were polls showing in the last spring, that it would probably get passed. But I think, once the opposition, I think the opposition was more affected than the support of it in terms of the media campaign. I think there were also, I think the inclination is when you're not sure to vote no, and I think there was some of that. I think there was, a lot of talk about, and this is not really true, but there was a lot, okay, this is me taxing retirement income, for example. Well, the legislature can tax retirement income right now. This didn't change that one way or the other, but I think a lot of people sort of accepted that narrative. I heard another narrative that, well, now the legislature can raise taxes without a vote of the people. Well, that's true now. That's always been true. But I think that the opponents were better at coming up with a narrative about why not to vote for this than the proponents were. I thought the pro fair tax message was fairly weak, honestly. So I'm not completely surprised. But as Larry said, for me, it's like a state employee. It's not the greatest, I guess, but
They're going to have to increase income taxes now for sure.
Well, that's another thing that Pritzker has indicated, and I don't know what will happen, but there's been that, there may be across the board income tax increase. So, that's possible. But again, I guess one narrative that sort of irked me, and people have, can vote for however they want, obviously, and they may have good reasons. But this idea that the people vote on tax increases is just not true. So if the legislature wants to raise taxes, in January or whatever, they can do that. The people don't vote on it. So that just seemed like a mischaracterization of what's the political process.
Okay, we've got Question from your friend up in Minnesota, Larry.
Okay.
Jeff asks, I can't remember such a disparity between rural and urban, suburban votes. Do you think this is only because of Trump? How could the Democrats try to change this trend?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question also. I have a cousin who, well, her husband was a rural Democrat, state legislator in Missouri. And then when he was term limited, she ran for his seat and then lost. And this was, an area that is really turned over. I think it's probably hard to keep the rural and the suburban coalition together. I was looking at some data, of Illinois counties and how they voted. And I don't know if I'm going to get this exactly right, but Fulton County, which is next to here, which is kind of a rural county, but also traditionally Union. In 2000, Fulton County voted for Al Gore, the Democrat, by about 55%. In 2020, Fulton County voted for Trump by about 60%. So you've got a 15-point swing in that 20 years. And so I think the Democrats have to, in some ways, they have to choose between their suburban and their rural coalitions, because I think some of the things they're going to do abortion probably being more pro-choice appeals more to suburban voters, but may turn off more rural voters. Things like protectionism and support for unions, it may be more appealing to rural voters, but may not be all that appealing to suburban voters. So I think that it's probably a hard row for the Democrats to get rural voters back. I don't know, Larry, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm not sure.
I don't offhand think of any issue the Democrats can use that will get broad support among rural voters. I just don't know, unless like it's a war or something like that and people rally around the government. I've lived in Macomb for 1967. It's always been a rural area and it's always been Republican, even though it's a college town. It's just part of the territory. If the Democrats want to gain control of power in the country, they're going to have to focus on the suburbs as much as they possibly can. They're going to have to focus on young voters. They're going to have to focus on minority voters from the standpoint of race and ethnic background. They're going to have to depend on women voters in lots of ways. I think it's just not going to work if they try to focus on now. Okay, suppose a big factory comes to a town. They bring unions with them, and you rebuild the culture that way. My experience has been when new companies come to town, they usually don't bring the unions with them. And so you might have employment, but you don't get the union kind of discipline and mentality when it comes to elections.
And I guess kind of going back to John's question a little bit, another issue with, sort of how Trump is maybe different than traditional Republicans and how that plays out in terms of realignment. So, before Trump, some Republicans were making noises about cutting back farm subsidies and things like that because they saw, farm subsidies as big government. And Trump clearly is not on that train. He's but that I think also makes it harder for the Democrats to appeal to rural voters because Trump is out there saying, okay, we're going to try to help you out. That makes a difference. Now, if the Republicans post-Trump were to go back more to this position, we're going to have smaller government, including scaling back some farm subsidies and things like that, then maybe that would provide an opening for the Democrats. But again, I don't know how that's all going to play out.
Question.
What impact do you think the so-called split between the Democratic progressives and moderates in the House and the narrowness of whoever has a majority in the Senate ends up with? Well, what impact do you think that will have on the Biden legislative program?
So you're asking the kind of split between the AOC wing and the moderate wing in the House and how that will affect Biden's legislative program?
Right. Coupled with the rather close either way.
Yeah, I'm assuming that the Republicans will keep control of the Senate. I think it's going to be difficult. Frankly, I don't think that probably the Democrats will win either of the Georgia seats, but I think if they win one, that's a good outcome for them. I think the Republicans historically in these runoff elections in Georgia, they've been more dominated by Republican turnout. So the result has been more Republican than the initial election. Now, you have Stacey Abrams there, who's done a lot of things to increase Democratic turnout. I'm sure she's going to still be working on that. You've also got probably every Democrat and every Republican across the country who's throwing money into these races because this is the big bang. So we'll see how that all plays out. But I'm going to assume that the best case scenario for Democrats is 51-49, but I think more likely 52-48. I think Biden is more of I think he's got very good political skills. People seem to like him. Of course, we're in the honeymoon now, and so we'll see. 6 months from now, but he's got a lot of good contacts in the Senate. Does that change Mitch McConnell's political incentives? No, I don't think it does. So Mitch McConnell, even if he does like Biden, I don't think that's how Mitch McConnell changes how he thinks about power. So assuming that the Republicans are still in control, which again I'm assuming, I don't know that Mitch McConnell is going to cooperate that much with Biden. In the House, there is going to be that split, and I think it reflects some, kind of the Republican split between the kind of strong Tea Party people who want to, vote against everything in the past, and then the more moderate Republicans who have represented these swing districts, and a lot of those lost, and then some of them, their successors won again in this election. So, I think you may have a dynamic that's playing out, kind of reflecting what the Republicans had when they were in the majority a few years ago. I think that Biden's instincts are more moderate. I think that he is more of a transactional politician rather than an ideological politician. So I think his instincts are to try to work more with the moderates. I think you may see things. I'd be interested to see what happens with the Green New Deal and things like that. I don't think there's even enough votes to pass that in the House anymore. The Democrats would have picked up 15 seats, like some people predicted maybe that would have happened, but I don't see that happening now. So I think if he's going to have any successes, I frankly think the left is probably going to have to make more compromises, frankly. That's kind of how I see it. I don't know.
A little different. Biden's going to have to govern from the middle. I think he was expecting that. I think even if the Democrats had held seats in the House, I think he was still going to govern from the center. I think the first priority is do something about the pandemic and something to bail the economy out. I think there's probably could be some fairly substantial coalitions on that. And I think, I'm no fan of Mitch McConnell. He may find Biden easier to deal with than Trump, and when it comes to governing. And so there might be room in there. And I think of some Republicans like Lisa Murkowski, and I think of Mitt Romney. It's a possibility for something in that area. In foreign policy, however, I think Biden will have a more free hand. I think he'll go back to try to reestablish the deal with Iran over missiles and weapons. I think we'll go back into the World Health Organization. I think we'll be involved in that. I think we'll kind of build back our connections to NATO. Those he can do really largely without reference to who controls the center of the House. But I don't think you're going to look for major legislative achievements in the Biden administration, not in the first 2 years, and almost certainly not in the second 4 years.
And I think one other thing sort of along the lines of what Larry's saying, I do agree that you're going to see more governing by executive order. And so that sort of precludes going to the legislative branch. I do find that troubling, honestly. I didn't like it when George W. Bush did. I didn't like when Obama did. I didn't like when Trump did it. I really think that that's against the Constitution in some ways. I understand why they do it because everything's so polarized and you can't get anything done. But I do think it's troubling the fact that many recent presidents have gone around the legislature, and I assume if Biden's going to get anything done, he's going to have to do the same thing. But I don't like.
I have a
Question?
I was speaking with a friend the other day who I said something I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. You might. She said, I suspect that Biden will not actually do very much, and it will spur very substantial period in this country. And I looked at it kind of funny, and she said, well, Eisenhower played a lot of golf. And during that time, the economic development was huge. The interstate highway system got built. A great many things happened. Now, the Cold War came along as well, but during that time, the economic growth was substantial. And he seemed to think that the next period of time with Biden in the White House would be much the same. A nice guy, but I just said I wasn't sure what to think of all that.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it is. I guess let me say I think there's a famous book about Eisenhower called The Hidden Hand Presidency, which suggests that Eisenhower was not just playing golf, but he was doing stuff in ways that were maybe not overt, but still doing a lot behind the scenes. I guess I would also say, one difference I see between Eisenhower and Biden is with Eisenhower's military background, he was very tuned in to being a manager of a large organization, whether it be the military or then the federal government when he becomes president. Biden really hasn't. I mean, he hasn't managed, his career has really been more in the legislative branch. And so I think he's going to do a lot. And maybe he'll do it in a hidden hand way like Eisenhower, but I think he wants to do a lot. I think the question is both, as the previous question alluded to with Congress, is he going to be able to? And also with the bureaucracy, I mean, I think you've got to really, and I think the COVID response has reflected some of this. You've really got a deteriorating situation with the professionalism of government that I think it's imperative that the president address. And I don't know. I mean, I hope Biden can do that, but I don't know. I remember one of the things that Barack Obama said that I hated the most, when he said one time, I didn't become president to manage some bureaucracy. But yeah, in a way, you do become president to manage some bureaucracy, because you got to manage the federal government. You can see what's happened with mismanagement of the federal government, I think, in the last year or so, last 8 months. And so I think that's going to be a big challenge for Biden. And I think that that's something he really needs to rise to the occasion to. And if he does, just sort of schmooze with people and stuff, that's not going to be enough to do it.
You got to remember too, Eisenhower won 2 very big elections decisively in 52 and 56, even though he governed 8 years, 6 of them the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. So you didn't get a lot of major legislative achievements. What Eisenhower did was, it seemed to me, calm things. People trusted him, didn't expect too much. The economy was booming. Yes, we had a Cold War, but people trusted Eisenhower and that kind of establishment to do the right thing. And there was nothing really very controversial about Dwight David Eisenhower. You said something really interesting. And I've been thinking
This is the first time.
Yeah, well, congratulations. You mentioned managerial experience. I've been thinking, how do you explain Donald Trump? And trust me, I don't have an explanation. Leaving aside mental issues or psychological issues, which I'm not able to judge, almost every president of the United States we've had up to Trump has either had significant elected or appointed political experience. And those that didn't, 3, Eisenhower's 1, Zachary Taylor was another, and U.S. Grant was a 3rd, had really significant military experience where they had to manage large bodies of troops. They had to learn how to follow chain of command. They had to learn to make hard decisions that cost people's lives. Politically, politicians, say what you want about them. They learn how to deal. They learn how to give and take. They learn how to achieve something big by giving up something small. When you look at Donald Trump, he had none of that. His experiences of the cutthroat New York real estate activities, where it's hard to define his success. I mean, what kind of successful businessman declares bankruptcy 6 or 7 times? Did Rockefeller do that? Did Carnegie do that? Did Bill Gates do that? No. So you've got a guy who has no give and take background. He's never had to make managerial decisions that cost people's lives or follow a chain of command. In some ways, he walked into the office of the presidency, probably, maybe unexpectedly, from the standpoint of the kind of useful experience that almost every other president has had. He didn't have it.
I mean, I do think there's something in the analogy of sort of the affability and maybe the personal qualities, that being able to get along with people. And I think there is something to that, the comparison between Biden and Eisenhower. But I also think, as Larry sort of alluded to, they're dealing with completely different political situations.
Well, I didn't mean to oversimplify it or throw pies at Eisenhower, but there were two, the synonym of temperaments
Yeah.
were similar.
No, I think there is something to that for sure.
Couple questions
Go
coming
ahead,
in
Sue.
online. Why don't more capable and empathetic candidates rise to the top in presidential elections?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Well, first of all, it's really time consuming to run for president. You've got to do a lot of stuff for a long period of time. And secondly, I think you've got to have a pretty strong constitution. I don't mean a written document. I mean makeup to do that kind of stuff.
Well, there was an article that I use in my class, and this more related to Congress, but it was this anonymous member of Congress sort of talking about the dysfunction with Congress. But one thing he or she said, I don't know who it is, and I'll see if I can quote this right. The idea of exposing your family to 30-second attack ads is appalling to most families. The idea of spending your life begging strangers you don't know for money is anathema to most self-respecting people. And so I think we create a political system where to get up through the ranks, you almost have to be sort of messed up in a way. I don't know if I want to put it that strongly, but I've been, and so, I ask my students this a lot: would you pursue a political career? And most of them don't want to for those reasons. And so I think we made politics so nasty, and I mean, I don't want to suggest this is a completely new thing, but I think the best people don't want to be politicians. And you think about it from even if you want power, being the president of a foundation or a think tank or something like that, you can have almost or even a super PAC or running a super PAC or something like that. You can have that, maybe more power even, but don't have to go through all these things. And I'm thinking about Lindsey Graham, I guess, for some of the things that he's been doing the last few weeks, and it just seems really odd to me, like his personality's been distorted or something. And I just wonder if that's what we're creating now, this system where the only way to get ahead is these people who have sort of kind of either never had or lost it and have completely lost their way. I don't know if that's a very good answer.
Well, I think there's a way ahead for people who want to do public service. It's just not going through the electoral process. Become appointed to something, an ambassador, a cabinet secretary,
Right.
A program director, where you're not necessarily subjected to personal attacks on a regular basis. And if things get too bad, you could simply resign. And, members of Congress usually don't resign. Presidents, except for one, don't resign. And so you're stuck for the full term And the closer you get to the end of that term, the worse things become.
Well, and I mean, I ran across this thing. Governor Pritzker's daughter apparently was apparently in high school. There was this fake tweet that showed her out celebrating something that wasn't even really her, I guess. But now, people have been inundating her social media account saying, you should die and all this stuff. And, she's like a teenager. So, I mean, first of all, if you're her father, are you going to think I'm really loving politics? And secondly, if you're her, are you going to say, am I going to follow my father into elected office? I just don't see it. So it's just, I think there are other ways. So I think from that perspective, America's got to get a grip on itself a little bit in terms of just the nastiness.
Did you see the other Republican who was offering $1,000 reward for pictures for Pritzker's Thanksgiving dinner?
Right, I saw that, and I mean, I think like if Pritzker goes out and parties on the beach, that's fair game. If he, but I mean, I'm not saying he's doing that. I think some of this is. He may or may not be
Picture Pritzker partying on the beach.
right. But I think that's fair game, and then he's a hypocrite, and he's done some things, but to go after people's children and this kind of stuff, I just think that's completely over the top to me. And even offering these rewards and stuff for seems pretty over the top to me.
Other questions, sir?
Does the situation that each state administers its own voting within constitutional limits mitigate risk of someone sabotaging voting accuracy wholesale, as alleged by the president now?
So, and I've been forgetting to repeat these questions, so let me do that. So the question was, does the sort of decentralized electoral system we have make it safer in a way, because it's hard to hack 50 state election system or 10,000 counties or whatever, as opposed to one big centralized system? Is that the question? Yeah. I think in a way it does. I think it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, I don't think some of these county election authorities, particularly in smaller counties, really have the expertise and stuff to fight this off. But I think, excuse my voice cracking here, I do think the questioner is right that it's harder to hack 10,000 county system, however many counties there are in the United States, than it is to hack one national election system, even if that system is going to be by definition more secure.
But again, if somebody wants to interfere with our system, they don't necessarily have to successfully hack. They just have to put the fear in the back of your mind that they are hacking it or that they can hack it, which might discourage people from voting or something else along that line.
And I guess, I think that's been more damaging, really, the Russian activity, the feed, this fake news through social media. And, apparently other countries are getting into the act now as well. And so that kind of thing, at least to date, I think. Now, I mean, obviously, if you did have some kind of major hack, that would be bad. But I think at this point, that's been a more serious problem than out and out hacking.
So,
Got one more line.
go ahead.
Okay. Did the unrest in several urban areas in the months leading up to the election, along with the rise of the defund the police debate, influence the disappointing state and local results for Democrats?
It's hard to tell right now. I think we need to have more. And let me say, I guess, normally I would depend on exit polls for questions like this, but with as unreliable as the polls are, I think the exit polls are even more unreliable. That said, I think the defund the police is a terrible message for the Democrats. I think it's, I think most people don't distrust the police. And I understand, African Americans are being distrustful of the police, and I totally get that. And I think they have good reason to. And I think, there's some argument that defund the police message heightened African American turnout. But I think overall, that was probably the Republicans' like that. I mean, there's a lot of evidence. Let me put it this way: the Republicans like that message from the Democrats. So from that perspective, I think if the Republicans liked it that much, it probably hurt the Democrats.
I think Keith is right. And I think the better message would have been refund to the police. That is, alter where money goes to the police, not so much in heavy weaponry as to maybe more training and psychological, different dealing with people with different problems and that sort of thing. My guess is that Trump, if there was one issue that caused Trump to lose, and I know Keith's chart shows something different. I think it was the virus and his response to it. Now, your chart showed that most people's main concern was the state of the economy.
Right.
But virus played into the state of the economy. I mean, that's what undercut the economy and essentially in the first place. So I think there's reading something today where when Trump got the virus, that there was a bump down in his public persona and the way people viewed it. Now, he bounced back because he took the bull by the horns when I did a bunch of rallies. But I think people say, well, wait a minute, if he gets it, then he must not be telling the truth about these kinds of things. Or maybe we're more unsafe than we thought we were.
Well, I think, yeah, I think that while the economy is more important, and I think that generally helped President Trump keep it close, I do, there's 1 out of 6 voters are saying that the coronavirus is their most important issue. And that's significant too. And I think that did have an impact on the election. And so
affected the manner in which people voted.
It also affected the manner in which people voted. Now, I think there were a lot of concerns that, people wouldn't be able to get the vote and that, turnout would be down. And that didn't really bear fruit. I mean, it looks like states found a way to get people to the polls, either by mail-in voting or whatever it is. And so, again, I think that's good news. But I do think that coronavirus hurt President Trump. There's no doubt about that in my mind. Again, it was not as big of an issue in the economy, but I think it was still a significant issue, and I think it still swayed a number of voters. There's a theory in political science called retrospective voting, and the basic idea is that if things are going okay in people's lives and they vote for the incumbent party, if things are bad, then they vote for the out party. And so I had told my students when we were talking about this the other day, I said, if Trump wins, then we know retrospective voting is not a good theory because it's hard to have anything worse than 2020. I think most people agree that this has been, the worst year on record or whatever. And so, from that perspective, I do think that the coronavirus hurt him. So.
Anything else, Sue?
We're right on time, 3 minutes to go. So any last questions or comments before we wrap it up?
Only one, Larry. I have somewhere sheet music for a 1936 campaign song called "We're Standing for Landon," and I will try and get it to you. If you
Thank
can
you.
learn it for the next second.
As I remember, he had the symbol was the sunflower, wasn't it? The Kansas.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And his daughter was in the Senate, Nancy Kassebaum,
Mhm.
or daughter-in-law, I guess. Maybe.
No, it was his daughter, Nancy Landon Kassebaum.
Okay. Okay. So do you want me to close it up?
Yeah, we can close it up. And who do we got next, Larry? I think we got
Next week, in 2 weeks, we have a trip back to something most of us remember. We're going to have Richard Philippink, who's our recent U.S. historian and an expert on Richard Nixon, and we're going to talk about the Nixon era. I remember it very well. And most people who don't remember it directly know something about it. It's the only time a president resigned. It's the greatest political scandal in American presidential history so far. So I think that we'll have a lot of talking, a lot of questions, and we'll see you on the first Wednesday in December.
So thank you for joining us, and thanks, Keith. I know you've had a long day teaching, so.
Okay.
Thank you.
appreciate you
Thank
joining us.
you.
And thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time. And you, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you.